It began not with the roar of tanks or the thunder of bombs, but with something quieter, colder, and infinitely more difficult to detect. A shift in alliances, a shadow drawn across borders, suspicion that could not be named, but was suddenly everywhere. In the final days of World War II, when the dust of global destruction had barely settled and Europe still smoldered in ruin, two superpowers emerged from the ashes with very different visions for the future, and neither of them would step aside to make room for the other. The United States, armed with its industrial might, atomic weapons, and a powerful image of freedom, sought to mold the post-war world in its image. A global marketplace of open democracies, capitalist economies, and American influence stretching across continents. But on the other side of the map, rising from the frostbitten heart of the East, the Soviet Union saw a different future. One built on the ruins of fascism, defended by communist ideology, and shielded by a buffer of satellite states loyal not to their people, but to the Kremlin. Though they had fought side by side to defeat Hitler's regime, the bond between the Allies had always been uneasy, a partnership of necessity rather than belief. With the war over, their differences no longer needed to be ignored. And as negotiations broke down in conference rooms from Yalta to Potsdam, it became clear that a new kind of conflict had already begun. One that would not be fought in open fields or vast seas, but in embassies, city streets, coded transmissions, and whispers passed through crowds. No formal declaration was ever made. No front lines were ever drawn. Instead, the world was pulled into an invisible war of ideology, influence, and infiltration, where alliances were tested by espionage, and entire governments could be swayed by information alone. The Cold War was not cold because it lacked danger, but because it burned slowly, with fear instead of fire, silence instead of sound, and strategy instead of shock. In Washington, Moscow, Berlin, and beyond, a new kind of warfare was taking shape, one built not on soldiers, but on secrets. Intelligence agencies began to rise in importance, moving from the shadows of military bureaucracy to the front line of national survival. In the United States, the newly created Central Intelligence Agency stepped into the role of global eyes and ears, gathering, analyzing, and sometimes shaping information to match national interests. Across the world, the Soviet KGB did the same, though with a brutal efficiency, born from a regime that had long mastered the use of fear. Propaganda became a second language spoken through posters, films, and public speeches, crafted to divide populations not with truth, but with carefully shaped narratives. What could not be won through open battle would now be contested through culture, science, ideology, and the quiet manipulation of perception. Every election, every uprising, every whisper of rebellion became a potential battleground. The goal was no longer to conquer land, it was to control minds. The Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill famously called it, was not a single wall, but a metaphorical barrier, one of secrecy, surveillance, and silence, stretching from the Baltic to the Adriatic, dividing not only territory but families, cities, and entire worldviews. People on both sides of this divide woke each day uncertain of what was true and what was propaganda, what was protected and what was being watched, who could be trusted and who had already been turned. In this world of shadows, paranoia was not a symptom, it was survival. Citizens learned to lower their voices, to mistrust their neighbors, to assume that their phones might be tapped, their letters opened, their lives observed by eyes they would never meet. And often, they were right. Surveillance became the oxygen of the Cold War, invisible but constant, filling every space, every conversation, every thought with a quiet, persistent pressure. As both superpowers raced to expand their influence, from Latin America to the Middle East, from Southeast Asia to Sub-Saharan Africa, covert operations multiplied in the shadows. And soon, the intelligence agencies of dozens of nations were locked in an intricate web of deceit. Coups were orchestrated. Regimes were propped up or toppled. Dissidents were followed, infiltrated, and sometimes erased. The world map became less a geography of borders and more a shifting field of influence, secrecy, and silent control. The Cold War was never only about missiles or tanks or treaties. It was about information, who had it, who didn't, and how far they were willing to go to protect or exploit it. It was about the war behind the war, the game played underneath the surface of diplomacy, where a single defection, a single leak, or a single coded message could tip the balance of power and ignite a crisis that might never be explained to the public. And so, the Cold War began, not with an explosion, but with 1,000 quiet decisions made in rooms without windows, in archives, in basements, in embassies, and safe houses. War fought not by soldiers in uniform, but by men and women whose names would never appear in history books, whose victories would be classified, and whose failures could change the course of nations. It was a war in which silence was louder than sound and suspicion more powerful than bullets. It had only just begun. As the world divided into East and West, freedom and control, capitalism and communism, something else was quietly being built beneath the surface. Not armies, not weapons, but vast networks of intelligence agencies, each one tasked not with fighting open battles, but with uncovering secrets, manipulating events, and securing invisible victories that would never be announced on the world stage. In this new kind of warfare, information had become the most valuable currency, and the men and women who could gather it, intercept it, decode it, or distort it were suddenly more powerful than generals. The Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, born from the remnants of the wartime Office of Strategic Services, emerged in the United States as the new vanguard of silent war, tasked with protecting the nation not by standing guard, but by burrowing into the minds, systems, and governments of potential enemies. It was not designed to patrol borders or guard embassies. It was designed to know everything, see everything, and, when necessary, to act in ways that would never be publicly admitted. What began as a group of analysts and field officers quickly expanded into a global force, covert, autonomous, and terrifyingly adaptable. On the other side of the ideological divide, the Soviet Union, SKGB, the Komitet Gosudstavstvennoy Bezopasnosti, was forged from a long lineage of secret policing that had been perfected since the days of Lenin and Stalin, where the CIA operated with the calculated freedom of a decentralized democracy. The KGB operated under a strict, methodical doctrine of total state surveillance and political control. Its agents were everywhere, in the cities, in the factories, in the universities, and even in families. In the Soviet world, secrets were not a tool. They were a necessity for survival, and everyone, knowingly or not, became part of the system that preserved them. While the CIA focused on projecting influence overseas, shaping foreign governments, and funding proxy forces, the KGB focused as much inward as outward, controlling dissent, crushing opposition, and monitoring every level of society for signs of ideological deviation. But abroad, it operated with equal intensity, embedding deep cover agents in Western capitals, gathering intelligence through bribery, seduction, blackmail, and betrayal, while protecting its own secrets with deadly efficiency. To cross the KGB was to risk more than disgrace. It was to vanish. Other nations soon followed suit. British MI6, already seasoned by wartime operations, adapted to the Cold War with renewed focus, using old imperial networks and elite private schools to feed a new generation of spies. France expanded the DGSE. Israel developed the Mossad into one of the most feared and capable intelligence agencies in the world. China, East Germany, and even smaller nations began to construct surveillance machines of their own. The Cold War became not just a contest between two giants, but a labyrinth of overlapping intelligence webs, each watching, each listening, and each plotting in the dark. What made this rise so dangerous was that intelligence work, unlike diplomacy or warfare, operated entirely in shadows. Failures could be buried, mistakes could be denied. The public was kept in ignorance, and within that silence, ethical lines could be crossed with terrifying ease. Assassinations could be staged as accidents. Revolutions could be manufactured. Elections could be rigged, not through violence, but through rumors, forged documents, and the subtle orchestration of chaos. The truth, once compromised, became almost impossible to recover. Technology advanced rapidly to serve this hidden world. Cryptographic machines were developed to send and intercept coded messages, most famously the American SkyGuide programs and the Soviet efforts to penetrate them. Tapped phone lines, miniature microphones, secret cameras hidden in pens, shoes, and picture frames became tools of the trade. A simple briefcase might contain an entire listening station. A smiling diplomat might, in fact, be a seasoned handler running multiple double agents. Recruitment became an art form. The best spies were not always soldiers or patriots, but people with something to lose, a scandal, a debt, a secret of their own. Some were blackmailed. Others were seduced, not only by people, but by ideology, by promises of a different world, by the thrill of betrayal itself. And some did it for nothing but the belief that what they were doing, in the end, would prevent a war that neither side could survive. Inside the agencies themselves, a culture of deep secrecy and suspicion took root. Even among allies, information was rarely shared without careful vetting. Departments competed against each other. Misinformation was sometimes planted internally, just to test loyalty. Paranoia became institutional, and in many cases justified. Mole hunts became common. Agents vanished. Defections occurred with shocking consequences. No one, not even the handlers, could be certain who was working for whom. The line between truth and deception was blurred deliberately. Field reports were edited, sources were invented, files were fabricated. Even when real intelligence was gathered, it could be twisted to fit the strategic goals of a larger operation. There were no neutral facts in this war, only usable ones. And so the intelligence agencies of the Cold War became something far more than secret police or information networks. They became engines of perception, tools of statecraft, and in many cases, the true architects of history, operating beneath headlines, beneath parliaments, and sometimes even beneath their own government's awareness. As the Cold War deepened, it became clear that victory would not go to the side with the most tanks or the strongest economy. It would go to the side that could outthink, outmaneuver, and out-infiltrate the other, in whispers, in wires, and in rooms that the public would never see. The age of open war was over. The age of shadow war had begun. Beneath the polished shoes, clean suits, and polite conversations, a different kind of life was unfolding, one made of masks, false names, and carefully constructed lies that had to be rehearsed so many times, they eventually became more familiar than the truth. In the Cold War, to be a spy was not to be a cinematic hero or villain. It was to become a walking contradiction, trusted by none. Loyal to causes that shifted like fog and sustained only by the thinnest thread of belief that what you were doing was worth the price you paid in silence, paranoia, and eventual abandonment. Spies were not born. They were built, sometimes slowly, sometimes in a moment. Some were recruited in college classrooms, noticed for their intellect, their political leanings, or their social vulnerabilities. Others were drawn from military ranks, diplomatic corps, or academic institutions. Still more were civilians caught in desperate circumstances, an unpaid debt, a family member in trouble, a past mistake that could be weaponized. The reasons varied, but once the first step was taken, there was rarely a way back. The transformation began with small tests, the delivery of a package, the memorization of a phone number, the passing of a message inside a book, and then it grew. Training was not loud or dramatic. It was slow and exact. Agents were taught how to walk without being followed, how to identify surveillance without drawing attention, how to pass information using dead drops, brush passes, and invisible ink. Construct legends, false backstories that were so detailed and rehearsed that they could withstand interrogation. A good spy didn't just lie to others. A good spy believed their own cover. But it was not all technique. Much of it was psychological. Spies had to learn how to live with isolation, to make peace with the fact that they could never share everything with anyone, that trust was a risk, and that even their most intimate relationships might one day be compromised or used against them. Every smile had to be measured. Every word could be recorded. Every gesture could be misread. It was a life lived under constant observation, even when no one was visibly watching. The most valuable spies were often those who lived closest to the line. Diplomats with access to secure information, scientists in classified research programs, mid-level officials who were overlooked by their superiors but privy to secrets. These individuals were courted carefully, their motivations studied, their weaknesses mapped like terrain. Recruitment was not just persuasion, it was seduction. A slow unraveling of allegiance, a careful appeal to ego, to ideology, to resentment, or to fear. Some spies were ideologues, believers in the cause they served, convinced that their betrayal was not betrayal at all, but an act of conscience. Others were opportunists, willing to trade information for money, status, or the thrill of danger. A few were simply survivors, caught between two forces, choosing the path that promised protection or revenge. And a rare handful were double agents, playing both sides in a game so complex that even they sometimes forgot where their true loyalties lay. The toll was immense. Spies lived with the constant fear of exposure. Every meeting was a risk. Every phone call might be tapped. Every misstep could result in imprisonment, torture, or death. Not just for themselves, but for the people they touched along the way. Many lived alone. Some developed paranoia, others lost their sense of self, and more than a few disappeared without explanation. Their stories ending not with glory, but with silence. Betrayal was a constant threat, and it came not just from enemies, but from within. Agencies turned on their own. False accusations led to ruined lives. Deep cover agents were abandoned when they became liabilities. And moles. Agents secretly working for the other side could undo years of careful operations with a single leak. Friendships were questioned. Partnerships were tested. The longer a spy survived, the more people they learned not to trust. Famous spies like Kim Philby, Aldrich Ames, and Oleg Penkovsky became symbols of these layered betrayals. Some defected and lived, writing memoirs and giving interviews. Others were caught, tried in secret, and executed in rooms no one would ever see. Their fates served as warnings both to enemies and to allies that the world of espionage had no safe harbor, no guarantees, and no forgiveness. But despite the danger, the betrayals, and the unbearable loneliness, spies kept working. They passed documents, planted bugs, recruited sources, and shaped the very course of the Cold War without ever appearing in history books. Their contributions were classified, their failures were buried, their names were often erased, and even in death, they remained unknown. To live as a spy in the Cold War was to live as a ghost in plain sight, never fully present, never fully absent, constantly watching and constantly being watched. It was to play a role so convincingly that it consumed the actor. It was a life that demanded everything and promised nothing. If the Cold War was a conflict defined by silence, then that silence was anything but empty. Beneath the hush of cautious voices and the surface calm of public order, entire cities had been transformed into intricate systems of listening, recording, and watching. A web of ears and eyes woven into the very structure of everyday life. Surveillance was not a tool that came later, once tensions had escalated. It was one of the earliest foundations of Cold War logic. The belief that knowledge could be weaponized, that the only way to remain safe was to hear what was never meant to be heard. From Moscow to Washington, from Berlin to Prague, buildings were no longer just homes or offices. They became soundboxes, resonant chambers where every murmur might be caught, every phone call captured, every footstep analyzed. Walls were fitted with hidden microphones. Light fixtures were rigged with listening devices. Hotel rooms were designed to hear what guests assumed was private. Nothing was left to chance. If there was a place someone might speak freely, there was an attempt to hear it, record it, and pass it on. The KGB mastered this art with terrifying precision. In Soviet cities, entire floors of buildings were reserved not for living, but for listening, filled with operators wearing headphones for hours on end, trained to recognize voices, accents, and even patterns of silence. Phone lines were routed through centralized hubs where every conversation could be intercepted. Typewriters were monitored. Radios were restricted. And in many cases, even children were encouraged to report unusual conversations overheard at home. Under the banner of patriotic duty, but the West was hardly innocent. In East Berlin, a city divided not just by ideology, but by stone and steel. The Stasi, East Germany's notorious secret police, built a surveillance system so comprehensive that 1 in every 6 citizens was involved in some form of reporting. They bugged churches, schools, apartments, and cafes. They opened letters with steam and resealed them with surgical care. They installed cameras and smoke detectors and microphones and flower pots. People were trained to listen not just with their ears, but with their behavior, studying posture, tone, hesitation, and eye movement to detect potential deviation from ideological norms. Even in democratic countries, surveillance became normalized. Intelligence agencies in the United States and the United Kingdom engaged in extensive domestic wiretapping programs, sometimes justified by national security, sometimes simply tolerated because of the fear that any hole in the net might be the one that let the enemy through. The post office became an extension of the state. Universities began reporting on professors. Activist groups found themselves infiltrated by informants who smiled in meetings and took notes in private. The enemy could be anyone, and because of that, everyone became a suspect. Technology advanced to serve this appetite. Directional microphones could now pick up conversations from across the street. Parabolic dishes could isolate voices through closed windows. Recordings could be filtered and enhanced. Signal intelligence, or SIGINT, became one of the fastest-growing sectors of intelligence operations. Not only were agencies listening in real time, they were collecting data in massive archives, hoping to detect patterns, predict movements, or expose betrayals not yet fully formed. Whole buildings were constructed with surveillance in mind. The U.S. Embassy in Moscow, for example, was famously discovered to be so thoroughly bugged during construction that it had to be abandoned as a secure site before it was ever used. Listening posts were embedded in embassies, disguised as furniture or art. Vehicles were wired. Airplanes carried equipment designed to intercept radio signals from hundreds of miles away. The very air seemed filled with invisible conversations, and both sides were racing to catch as many of them as possible. But beyond the hardware and the headlines, the most insidious part of surveillance was its psychological effect. People changed the way they spoke. Not just in public, but in private. They whispered even when they were alone. They avoided certain phrases, coded their emotions, rehearsed their expressions in mirrors. Families developed internal languages. Lovers grew cautious. Children were taught to never repeat anything they heard at home, even to their closest friends. Paranoia became the default setting of human interaction. And when surveillance reached its deepest levels, it no longer required wires or tape recorders. It relied on people, informants, colleagues, friends, sometimes even spouses. A man could kiss his wife goodnight, not knowing that her real allegiance lay with the state. A teacher could be reported by a student. A party member could be denounced by his own secretary. It was not simply that people were being watched, it was that the watchers were indistinguishable from the watched. The line between victim and participant began to blur. In cities like Budapest and Warsaw, even silence was suspicious. Saying nothing could be interpreted as dissent. Walking the wrong route to work might raise questions. Changing the subject during a political conversation could trigger a file to be opened, and that file might follow you for the rest of your life, affecting your job, your travel, your family, and even your future children. Once surveillance took hold, it became self-replicating. It justified itself. It expanded because the fear it created always seemed to demand more. And yet, within this vast machinery of listening, there were still moments of resistance. People learned to tap code with their fingers. Radios were hidden in walls and attics. Messages were passed through shared glances, folded napkins, or barely audible coughs. For every ear pressed against the wall, there was a voice that found a way to slip past unnoticed. Sometimes in poetry, sometimes in music, sometimes in total courageous silence. But the price was always there, just beneath the surface. The knowledge that someone might be listening changed the very shape of thought. You did not just speak carefully. You began to think differently, to censor ideas before they even formed into words. This was the true legacy of Cold War surveillance. Not just the recordings. It's not just the files. not just the piles of reels and transcripts stored in secret vaults. It was the reshaping of the human mind into a quieter, more cautious version of itself. A mind trained not to ask, not to trust, and above all, not to be heard. By the time borders had hardened, alliances had formed, and surveillance had seeped into daily life, it became clear that the Cold War would never be won with weapons alone. It would be fought, and perhaps decided, in the minds of the people. This was not an accidental front. It was a carefully constructed battlefield where words replaced bullets, stories replaced facts, and belief itself became the most valuable territory a nation could conquer. Psychological operations known in intelligence circles as PsyOps were not mere adjuncts to military action. They were weapons in their own right, aimed not at armies, but at entire populations. The goal was simple in theory, but devastating in practice: to manipulate perception so thoroughly that truth no longer held weight, that uncertainty became habitual, and that people no longer knew what to believe, let alone who to trust. If you could control what people thought, or even better, what they feared to think, you did not need to fire a single shot to render them compliant. If you could make someone doubt their leaders, their neighbors, their history, or even their own memory, then you had already won half the war. Both East and West invested heavily in these campaigns. In the United States, the Central Intelligence Agency funded a wide range of media projects: books, films, music, magazines, and radio stations. Not for entertainment, but for influence. Radio Free Europe and Voice of America broadcast Western ideals deep into the heart of Soviet territory, cloaked in songs, interviews, and cultural commentary. These stations did not only deliver news, they delivered a worldview, a sense that life beyond the Iron Curtain was freer, more open, more beautiful, and more human. They sold not just capitalism, but emotional escape. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union produced propaganda of staggering scale posters, monuments, newspapers, and films that reinforced the supremacy of communism, the treachery of Western powers, and the inevitability of socialist victory. School children were taught from an early age to identify capitalist symbols as dangerous, to see America as a decaying empire of inequality and corruption. Heroism was not abstract. It was defined, illustrated, and reinforced daily through language, imagery, and collective ritual. History was rewritten to serve the party. Memory itself was managed by the state, but PsyOps did not stop at shaping opinion. They were also designed to create confusion, panic, and disorientation in enemy populations. Disinformation campaigns planted false stories in newspapers, staged fake political movements, and crafted elaborate hoaxes designed to destabilize public trust. In one famous operation, Soviet agents attempted to convince the world that the AIDS virus was a product of American military experiments, a lie that, despite its absurdity, found traction in parts of the world already suspicious of U.S. intentions. The CIA, for its part, explored everything from subliminal messaging to brainwashing to psychological torture. Not always in the field, but often in laboratories through secret programs like MKUltra, which tested the boundaries of control over human thought using drugs, hypnosis, and isolation. These experiments, though often disavowed publicly, revealed a deeper truth about the Cold War, that in a battle for the mind, even the most extreme methods could be justified under the banner of national security. Art itself became a tool of psychological warfare. Its abstract expressionism, seen by many as a rejection of totalitarian control, was quietly funded and promoted by Western institutions as a symbol of creative freedom. Meanwhile, Soviet realist paintings depicted workers and soldiers in near-divine glory, presenting a vision of society that was orderly, heroic, and unbreakable. Even the design of buildings, the shape of clothing, and the lyrics of songs were crafted with ideological intent. Nothing was neutral. Everything was part of the message. And perhaps most chilling of all was the way PsyOps blurred the line between foreign manipulation and domestic governance. Techniques developed to destabilize enemy states were often turned inward, used to suppress dissent, shape elections, or marginalize political opposition. Governments became addicted to the power of perception control. They realized that managing the narrative could be more effective and less messy than suppressing unrest through force. Ordinary citizens became the terrain over which these battles were fought. Conversation at a cafe, a letter to the editor, a performance at a theater. Any of these could be part of a broader campaign, shaped by forces invisible to those participating. People began to censor themselves, not just out of fear of punishment, but out of confusion, exhaustion, and the growing sense that nothing could be trusted. Mistrust became a public mood, and in that atmosphere, control became easy. By the end of the 1960s, it was clear that propaganda and PsyOps had become permanent features of Cold War life, not temporary measures, but enduring strategies. They had seeped into the fabric of daily existence, shaping how people saw the world, how they interpreted news, and even how they experienced memory. The war of minds had no clear front, no uniforms, and no armistice. It was waged in headlines and rumors and textbooks and broadcasts, in silence and in sound. And unlike tanks or missiles, the scars it left behind were invisible. But they endured long after the Cold War itself came to an end. There are wars that redraw maps with ink and treaties, and then there are wars that reshape the land with walls, checkpoints, and barriers so real they become part of a person's psychology. During the Cold War, it was not only minds and loyalties that were divided. Entire landscapes were carved up by suspicion. Geography became ideology. And the spaces people moved through each day were carefully designed to reinforce separation, control, and mistrust. The Cold War did not merely exist between countries. It existed between buildings, across alleys, between bricks in the same wall, in places where the border was invisible but brutally enforced. Nowhere was this more evident than in Berlin, a city that became the most visible scar of a divided world. Once the capital of a unified Germany, Berlin was sliced into 4 occupation zones after World War II. controlled by the Americans, British, French, and Soviets. At first, it was a fragile arrangement, a temporary compromise designed to avoid direct confrontation. But it did not last. As ideological lines hardened, West Berlin became a symbol of Western freedom. Isolated deep within East German territory, a capitalist island inside a communist sea, and an embarrassment to the Soviet bloc. In 1961, that tension took brutal form. Without warning, Soviet-backed East German authorities began building what would become the Berlin Wall, a barrier of concrete, barbed wire, guard towers, and death strips that severed streets, split families, and turned neighbors into foreigners overnight. Entire blocks were torn down. Buildings that once formed neighborhoods became walls themselves. Windows were bricked over. Doors were sealed shut. Trains stopped mid-route. People awoke to find that their lives had been bisected by a political reality they could not escape and did not choose. The wall did more than block movement. It rewrote memory, created a psychological reality in which East and West were no longer ideas, but destinations that could no longer be reached. Either way, it became a monument to the paranoia that defined the era, a literal line in the sand. Concrete proof that the Cold War had reshaped the very ground beneath people's feet. But Berlin was not the only place where geography was weaponized. Across the globe, new frontiers emerged. not through conquest, but through checkpoints, fences, and heavily patrolled zones. The Korean Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, became another symbol of unresolved tension, a buffer so dangerous that birds landing in the wrong field could trigger alerts. In divided cities across Eastern Europe, entire districts were sealed off. Travel required papers. Movement required permission. Streets that once flowed naturally now ended in dead ends. Patrolled by soldiers with rifles and orders to shoot, every checkpoint became a theater of control. People approaching a border were required to show identification, state their intentions, and submit to questioning. Not because they had done anything wrong, but because suspicion was the default. Guards studied not just documents, but body language, tone of voice, eye contact, even the way a person held their hands. A slight hesitation could lead to hours of interrogation. A wrongly timed joke could mean denial of entry. The geography of suspicion had no tolerance for ambiguity. In many places, the border was not a line at all, but a zone, a wide, empty stretch of controlled space filled with cameras, lights, dogs, and motion sensors. Entire villages were emptied to make room for this architecture of division. Surveillance towers loomed over fields. Trenches were dug. Sensors were buried beneath the earth. The land became a machine for identifying and stopping movement, and the people living near it became part of that machine. Both watched and watching, both trapped and used. And yet, people still tried to cross. Over walls, under fences, through tunnels, inside suitcases. Beneath trucks, the desperate urge for freedom, or simply reunion with loved ones, drove countless people to risk everything. Some succeeded, many did not. Border guards were instructed to fire on sight, and many did. Act! Their bullets became punctuation in a political sentence written by faraway leaders. The land itself became a weapon, claiming lives not through famine or flood, but through policy. This weaponized geography bled into cities as well. Safe houses were mapped like military installations. Streets were evaluated for escape routes. Parks, alleys, and even were chosen or avoided based on how easy it was to disappear. Urban planning itself became a tool of ideological control, with some cities redesigned to minimize gatherings, limit protest, and channel movement through areas that could be easily monitored or closed off in emergencies. And for those who lived within these landscapes, the effect was deep and lasting. Children grew up never seeing certain parts of their own cities. Entire generations learned to navigate by permission rather than curiosity. Families told stories of the other side like myths, strange, blurry images of streets they once knew, lives they once had, relatives they no longer saw. Geography became grief. Land became memory. Every wall was a wound, and every checkpoint a reminder of how fragile freedom truly was. Even after the Cold War ended, many of these physical and psychological barriers remained. The concrete was removed, but the maps in people's minds. The reflexive caution, the mistrust of borders, the unease around authority, lingered like echoes in a room long after the sound has died away. In a war where perception was everything, the terrain itself became a message, not just of division, but of permanence. The Cold War was never contained by borders, nor was it confined to cold climates, silent cities, or distant capitals. It seeped into every corner of the globe, not as a single war, but as a series of fragmented conflicts, covert actions, shadowy interventions, each one part of a larger drama that played out under the constant threat of escalation. From Cuba to Congo, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, the world became a stage on which the superpowers rehearsed their ideologies, tested their weapons, and sent their agents to manipulate events behind the scenes. These were not accidental entanglements. They were carefully chosen theaters of espionage, disruption, and controlled chaos. Each hotspot offered more than geography. It offered leverage, a chance to expand influence, contain an adversary, or project power without triggering full-scale war. And so the CIA, the KGB, and a host of other intelligence services descended into jungles, deserts, mountains, and cities, not to plant flags, but to pull strings. Often, the local populations had little idea of what was happening in the rooms just down the hall, the fields just beyond the hills, or the meetings taking place at midnight between men who spoke in code, shook hands without trust, and vanished by dawn. Cuba was one of the first major flashpoints, a tropical island suddenly elevated to global importance by the convergence of revolution, ideology, and proximity. When Fidel Castro rose to power in 1959, it signaled a dangerous shift to Washington. The idea that socialism could take root so close to the American coastline was intolerable. And yet, attempts to remove him only deepened the crisis. The CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was not merely a failure of planning, it was a lesson in hubris, a covert operation turned global humiliation. That pushed Cuba directly into the waiting arms of the Soviet Union. The result was the Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 days in October 1962, when the world hovered on the edge of nuclear war, not because of tanks or soldiers, but because of surveillance flights, intercepted messages, and the decisions of men who relied on incomplete information. The crisis was diffused, but the message was clear. Espionage could trigger catastrophe as easily as it could prevent it. And Cuba remained a symbol of how quickly a local conflict could spiral into something far larger than anyone had intended. In Southeast Asia, the war in Vietnam became another stage, not just for conventional fighting, but for covert interference, propaganda, and intelligence games that stretched far beyond the battlefield. The CIA operated extensively in Laos and Cambodia, recruiting local militias, funding operations that were never declared, and monitoring the spread of communism in a region many Americans could not even find on a map. The North Vietnamese, in turn, were supported by the Soviet Union and China, creating a web of alliances and rivalries so complex that the war could not be won, only prolonged. Africa, too, became a chessboard. In the Congo, Angola, and Ethiopia, newly independent nations were pulled into the Cold War, as both sides sought to shape their futures. Regimes rose and fell, not by elections, but by covert support. Arms were delivered in the dead of night. Leaders were assassinated or protected, depending on their usefulness. Intelligence agents posed as diplomats, relief workers, or journalists. Ideology was used as currency, and sovereignty became a myth. For many in these regions, the Cold War was not cold at all. It was brutal, immediate, and soaked in blood. Perhaps no theater was as haunting as Afghanistan, where the Soviet invasion in 1979 triggered a massive and secretive response from the United States. The CIA funneled weapons, money, training into the hands of Afghan mujahideen fighters, transforming a local resistance into a global insurgency. Stinger missiles were delivered by proxy. Propaganda was produced in local dialects. Schools were built not to educate, but to indoctrinate against the enemy. And in the process, seeds were planted. Seeds of extremism, of violence, of long-term instability, whose consequences would unfold long after the Cold War officially ended. Each of these theaters operated under the illusion of local autonomy, but the truth was always more tangled. Governments were toppled with plausible deniability. Civil wars were extended not for strategic necessity, but for psychological advantage. Aid packages came with invisible strings. Refugees became pawns. And the true motives of those involved were often buried beneath a cascade of lies, distractions, and staged justifications. What mattered was not morality. What mattered was momentum. The intelligence officers who operated in these places often lived in constant danger, not from direct combat, but from the shifting loyalties of those around them. Agents could be captured and tortured. Alliances could be broken with a single bribe or a single threat. Entire operations could unravel because of one overheard conversation or one intercepted letter. In many cases, the men and women on the ground were not even told the full truth about the missions they were supporting. They were instruments, sent to perform delicate surgeries with no guarantee that the patient would survive, or that survival was even the goal. And for the civilians trapped in the middle, the Cold War meant nothing and everything. They were told they were fighting for freedom, or for revolution, or for the future of the world, but most simply wanted peace. Instead, they were pulled into conflicts that weren't theirs, manipulated by strangers who never spoke their language, and forced to choose sides in wars they never asked to be part of. Their suffering was documented, debated, and weaponized, but rarely relieved. These global battlegrounds were the true heart of the Cold War, not the policy meetings in Washington or the speeches in Red Square, but the markets in Managua, the alleyways in Saigon, the deserts in Helmand, the forests in Angola, the places where ideology was made real, where espionage turned lethal, and where the invisible war showed its face. And though many of these places are no longer in the headlines, the scars remain, etched into the soil, the memory, the architecture of a world that was reshaped not by open war, but by the silent hands of spies. In a war defined by silence and secrets, there was no act more dangerous and more illuminating than speaking out. To defect from your country, to turn against your handlers, to expose the machinery from within was not merely a political statement. It was a personal rupture, a decision that shattered lives, rewrote allegiances, and left the individual caught in the vast and echoing space between two systems that each viewed betrayal as the ultimate crime. In the Cold War, defectors were both weapons and warnings, symbols of weakness and strength. Living proof that the illusion of unity could be broken by conscience, disillusionment, or desperation. The stories of Cold War defectors were rarely simple. They did not unfold in clean arcs or with tidy endings. Most were tangled webs of fear, manipulation, bravery, and deeply personal choices made in the loneliest corners of existence. Some defected for love, a relationship forbidden by the state, a life across the border just beyond reach. Others defected for ideology, disillusioned by the brutality of their own system, hopeful that life on the other side would offer a different kind of truth. But many, perhaps most, defected for survival because they had seen too much, said too much, or simply understood too late that their usefulness had expired. Defectors from the East were often greeted with headlines, interviews, and promises of safety, but the reality they entered was colder than expected. Though the West often celebrated high-profile defectors as victories of freedom over oppression, those individuals quickly learned that trust was a fragile currency. They were interrogated, monitored, and sometimes quietly discarded when their value diminished. Their pasts could not be erased. Their futures were uncertain. They were never truly home, only relocated, rebranded, and forever watched. Soviet defectors like Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB colonel who risked his life to provide intelligence to the British, lived under constant threat of assassination even after escape. Others like Anatoly Golitsyn brought not only secrets but suspicions, accusing nearly everyone around them of being double agents, sowing confusion that often crippled the very agencies they had sought to help. And some, like Alexander Litvinenko, who dared to speak about the darker undercurrents of post-Soviet power, paid with their lives, poisoned in exile, their deaths both symbolic and painfully real. The other side, Western defectors who fled to the Soviet bloc, often found that what had been promised was not what awaited them. They were used as propaganda trophies, paraded in newspapers and staged broadcasts, but behind the curtain, they were distrusted, isolated, and closely monitored. Some found themselves confined to guarded apartments, their movements restricted, their foreignness treated not as exotic but as suspect. Their dreams of justice or ideological belonging faded quickly, replaced by a quiet regret that could not be voiced aloud. The most complex cases were the double defectors, those who appeared to switch sides more than once, whether by choice, by coercion, or by necessity. These individuals lived in a twilight zone of uncertainty. No one fully trusted them. Every action was scrutinized, every motive questioned. Their very presence could fracture agencies, spark investigations, or unravel long-standing operations. They were both assets and liabilities, too dangerous to ignore, too unstable to rely on, and too entangled to simply release. Dissenters, meanwhile, did not always flee their countries. Many chose to speak from within. Journalists, artists, writers, scientists, and clergy who challenged the official narrative not by running, but by resisting. In the Soviet Union, figures like Alexander Solzhenitsyn used literature to peel back the lies of the regime, exposing the horror of the gulags in prose that slipped past censors long enough to shake the conscience of a generation. In the United States, whistleblowers like Daniel Ellsberg leaked classified documents to reveal the moral decay beneath foreign policy decisions, forcing entire nations to confront the gap between ideals and actions. These acts of dissent, whether explosive or quiet, came at enormous cost. Lives were destroyed. Careers ended. Families were torn apart. Some dissenters were imprisoned. Others were exiled. Many lived in obscurity, their courage recognized only decades later, long after the wounds they bore had been forgotten by those they tried to awaken. Their bravery, however, reshaped the Cold War in subtle but profound ways. Every defector made the walls of secrecy tremble. Every dissenter created cracks in the surface of control. Governments responded with predictable fury. Defectors were discredited. Dissenters were watched. Assassinations were staged to look like accidents. Smear campaigns were launched. Files were altered. Surveillance increased. And yet, for every silenced voice, another rose. Because truth, even in fragments, has a gravity that cannot be entirely suppressed. And once a system begins to fear its own people, it begins to decay from the inside out. In the end, the Cold War was not only a conflict of nations and systems, it was a war within individuals, a test of how much a person could bear, how deeply they could believe, and what price they were willing to pay when their conscience no longer aligned with the machinery around them. Defectors and dissenters were not just players in the great game. They were the breaks in the script. It's the unscripted moments that reminded the world that control is never absolute and silence is never truly secure. And though they often lived in exile, loneliness, or obscurity, they held a kind of power that no wiretap, missile, or spy could ever fully contain. The power of a truth spoken when the world had been trained not to listen. Long before satellites watched from the sky, long before cyber espionage turned data into the new battlefield, the Cold War was fought in alleyways, train stations, hotel lobbies, and park benches, in the quiet, unglamorous rituals of human intelligence. It was fought not with blaring alarms or bold confrontations, but with briefcases exchanged in silence, envelopes tucked behind bricks, chalk marks on lampposts, and coats that could turn one man into another in seconds. It was a world that demanded not just courage, but precision. A world built on the ancient art of tradecraft. Tradecraft was the language of spies, a language without words, built from objects, movements, and timing. It was a system designed to allow people to pass secrets, communicate across great distances, and avoid capture, all without speaking aloud or trusting a single electronic device. Its tools were mundane: cigarette packs, shoelaces, lipstick tubes, umbrellas, eyeglasses. But each had been redesigned, modified, and reimagined to hold microfilm, transmit code, or conceal poison. It was a world where nothing was ever what it seemed. One of the most iconic methods in this silent world was the dead drop, a way of transferring information without two agents ever having to meet in person. A dead drop could be a hollow tree stump, a magnetic box beneath a park bench, a loose brick in a crumbling wall, or a soda can left under a specific bench at a specific hour. The key was subtlety and consistency. A signal, like a chalk X on a mailbox or a newspaper, folded in an odd shape, would alert the other agent that the drop had been made. It could take days. It could take weeks. But if done correctly, it left no trace, no witness, and no risk of being overheard. Surveillance detection routes were another essential ritual. A field agent would never travel directly to a meeting. It would take indirect paths, double back through crowded intersections, board and exit trains at the last moment, pause at window reflections to spot a tail. A well-trained agent could spot a pattern of movement in a crowd within seconds, and if they sensed danger, they would abort, leaving nothing behind, vanishing like fog into the folds of the city. Disguises were not just for cover. They were for survival. Entire departments within intelligence agencies were devoted to perfecting the art of transformation. A change in posture, gait, or hairstyle could render someone unrecognizable. Silicone facial molds, false dental work, tinted contact lenses, and makeup kits were standard issue. A bald diplomat could grow a full head of hair by lunchtime, or appear to. A young woman could become an elderly man in the space of a taxi ride. Disguises were deployed not for spectacle but for functionality. To vanish through airports, to switch places mid-operation, to walk out of a room that had just been raided. The CIA's Office of Technical Services, often referred to as the Wizards, developed gadgets and tools that bordered on science fiction. Tiny cameras hidden in rings, recording devices embedded in pens, explosive chewing gum, cyanide capsules disguised as coat buttons. These were not props from films. They were real, tested in field conditions, and used in operations across the globe. Some worked. Some failed. But all were a testament to the level of detail and imagination required to stay alive in a game where mistakes were rarely forgiven. Passwords and code phrases were another layer of insulation. An agent might approach another in a bar and say something as simple as the tulips in Amsterdam bloom late this year, awaiting the correct reply. But the frost hasn't come yet. A misstep would end the conversation instantly, and likely result in both parties vanishing before anyone else could intervene. These phrases were updated frequently, memorized by rote, and deployed with icy calm, even under extreme pressure. Then there were the brush passes, those fleeting, choreographed moments when two people exchanged an object in public without ever acknowledging each other. A man reading a newspaper on a bench might drop a folded map. As a woman in gloves sat beside him, she would pick it up without speaking and walk away. It took less than 5 seconds. It required weeks of planning. If done correctly, no one else would ever know it happened. All of this operated under layers of compartmentalization. Most field agents did not know the full extent of the mission. Most handlers did not know the real names of their agents. Operations were segmented, details fragmented, and communication sparse, not out of inefficiency, but out of necessity. If one part of the operation was compromised, the others could still survive. Paranoia was not a flaw. It was protocol. For all its precision, Tradecraft was still human. It required judgment, instinct, and sometimes improvisation. Weather changed. Crowds shifted. Watchers appeared when least expected. A brush pass could go wrong because of a spilled drink. A disguise could slip in the rain. Even the best-trained agents sometimes panicked. Mistakes led to surveillance. Surveillance led to capture. And capture often meant torture. Or worse, the emotional toll was high. Agents lived under stress that could not be spoken aloud. They trusted no one fully. They lived with identities that were stitched together, rewritten often, and never quite whole. A birthday could not be celebrated. A family reunion could never happen. And even success brought no reward. Only more missions, more danger, and the quiet knowledge that no one, not even the people you worked for, would ever know what you had done, or what you had risked to do it. Yet, in that shadow world of locks, codes, and shadows, the machinery of the Cold War kept turning. Governments stayed informed. Coups were prevented, or orchestrated. Information flowed where it was needed, passed from hand to hand, always just ahead of discovery. The dead drop, the disguise, the silent handoff. These were not symbols of paranoia. They were the architecture of a world that had learned long ago that trust was dangerous and exposure was fatal. And through it all, the city kept moving, oblivious, unaware, and full of secrets waiting to be found. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union dissolved into fragments soon after, many believed they were witnessing the end of something permanent, the collapse of a conflict that had defined generations, the final breath of an era ruled by fear, secrecy, and silent war. In those first days of celebration and uncertainty, as people danced atop the broken concrete of division and marched through doors once guarded by rifles, it felt for a moment like the Cold War had ended not with violence, but with relief. The enemy was gone. The threat had passed. The silence could finally break. But that silence had a long memory. Though the missiles were stood down and the files unlocked, and the agents recalled, the world that emerged from the Cold War was not new. It was simply rearranged. The tools remained. Habits remained. The systems of control, of surveillance, of subversion, they did not vanish. They evolved. The Cold War ended on paper, but its echo reverberated through everything that came after, shaping nations, rewriting alliances, and hardening the invisible infrastructure of suspicion that had become second nature to entire governments, agencies, and citizens. In Eastern Europe, the newly opened archives revealed the depth of the surveillance state, not just in pages and names, but in relationships shattered by betrayal, in marriages broken by informants, in lifelong friendships destroyed by the realization that someone had been watching, writing, and reporting all along. For many, the fall of communism brought not freedom, but confusion, a sense that they had spent their lives performing roles in a play whose audience had always been hidden, and whose script had always been a lie. In the West, the legacy was more subtle, but no less real. Intelligence agencies, emboldened by decades of unchecked power, did not shrink. They expanded. The logic of secrecy remained entrenched. The Cold War had normalized the belief that some truths must remain hidden, that surveillance was a form of protection, and that trust was a luxury nations could no longer afford. New enemies were named. But the structure, the wiretaps, the informants, the dossiers, was already built. It simply changed its focus. And for the men and women who had lived inside that world, the end was never clean. Former spies faded into quiet retirement, unable to speak about their pasts, even to those they loved. Some were celebrated briefly, then forgotten. Others were tried, exposed, or hunted for crimes once sanctioned in secret. Many simply disappeared into obscurity, carrying with them secrets that would never be revealed, names that would never be cleared, loyalties that would never be explained. The psychological toll, too, endured. Whole generations had grown up in the shadow of war that had no front line, trained to listen without speaking, to suspect without accusation, to obey without understanding. For them, peace was not freedom. It was a new kind of uncertainty. Without an enemy clearly defined, the world felt unmoored. And many longed for the familiar structure of division, not out of ideology, but out of habit. The Cold War had become not just a period in history, but a lens through which people had learned to interpret reality. Technology, once harnessed to track whispers and encode messages, found new uses. The internet arrived not as a liberator, but as a new frontier for surveillance. The tools developed in the name of national security now reached into every home, every phone, every interaction. Where once walls were built to keep people in, now the architecture of control became invisible. Algorithms instead of barbed wire, metadata instead of manila folders. And still, the same Cold War logic endured. Know everything, trust no one, and act before being acted upon. The culture, too, bore the marks. Films, novels, and television continued to recycle the imagery of espionage, of shadowy figures and encrypted codes, of betrayals and quiet heroism. The spy became both myth and metaphor, a symbol of modern life itself, where identities were fluid, truth was conditional. And the line between appearance and reality, even in diplomacy, the Cold War cast a long shadow. International relations remained shaped by the binary thinking it had enforced. East versus West, friend versus foe, democracy versus dictatorship. It left behind a world addicted to conflict as narrative, where peace was not the default, but the brief pause between confrontations. It taught nations how to manage tension without resolution, how to speak in coded language, how to smile in public while planning in secret. It taught the art of appearing calm while always preparing for war. But perhaps the deepest legacy of the Cold War was the way it taught people to live in layers, to keep parts of themselves hidden, to perform safety while fearing exposure, to believe that even in times of apparent peace, danger was always near. It trained entire societies to internalize surveillance, to preempt judgment, to censor thought before speech. And that, above all, is what remained. A quiet, invisible residue of caution that outlasted the bombs, the slogans, and the Iron Curtain. For the Cold War was not merely a conflict, it was a way of being. And long after its borders were erased, long after its archives were opened, its spirit lived on, not in overt aggression, but in silence, in shadows, in the constant hum beneath modern life that still whispers, softly, that someone might be watching, even now.